A pleasant day to you, sir, and to anyone currently watching this video. We are the members of Group 8, and we're here to present to you a handful of concepts listed under Unit 3 Module 1 and Unit 4 Module 1 and 2. With that being said, let's begin this presentation. Unit 3 Module 1 is primarily focused on the idea of formal deductive logic, which is known as the study as to whether the structure of an argument is valid or invalid. It should be noted there is no in between, meaning that arguments can never follow a probability of it being half true or half false. There should always be a definite answer as to whether the structure of an argument is valid or invalid. That being said, deductive arguments are always composed of a premise and a conclusion, wherein it doesn't matter how many premises you have, all that really matters is that your argument contains one sound conclusion. Think of the argument, heavy rainfall was prevalent in the Philippines last September, therefore we had a lot of days where face-to-face classes were suspended. The premise of this argument would be the phrase, heavy rainfall was prevalent in the Philippines last September, as it introduces the foundation as to where you base your conclusion from, while the conclusion would be, therefore we had a lot of days where face-to-face classes were suspended, as this is the claim made from your argument that summarizes your point of view. By taking it all together, we can conclude that this is both a sound and valid argument. Because of the recent typhoons that we experienced last September, we usually resorted to an asynchronous or online modality of learning. Due to the fact that the premise is true, the conclusion naturally followed, thus making the argument valid. Now let's take a look at this argument further, by inspecting the logical structure behind it, where we strip the argument down of its content, leave only the bare-bone elements that represent the truth table. So instead of saying that heavy rainfall was prevalent in the Philippines last September, therefore we had a lot of days where face-to-face classes were suspended, we're instead left with the argument, if P, then Q. This argument remains valid as P or the premise is true, therefore Q or the conclusion is also true. This technique is referred to as modus ponens. But what if we were to make an argument with a premise that's true and a conclusion that's false? Let's try swapping the elements of our previous argument. From if P then Q, it becomes Q therefore P. Q becomes our new premise while P becomes our new conclusion. Saying these symbols out loud might sound confusing, so let's return the content of this argument. We had a lot of days where face-to-face classes were suspended, therefore, heavy rainfall was prevalent in the Philippines last September. Obviously, this argument is neither sound nor valid. The premise is true, as we did have a lot of days where we resorted to an asynchronous or online modality of learning. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because of the numerous suspensions of face-to-face classes would cause a few typhoons to hit the Philippines. The logic just doesn't add up. The conclusion must naturally follow the premise of an argument. This invalid argument form is referred to as affirming the consequent. Given everything that we've learned so far, let's try understanding a more concrete definition of a deductive argument. A deductive argument is a type of reasoning made up of a premise or a premise set and a conclusion, such that in all possible substitution instances of the truth values of the premises and conclusion, you will not have a case in its truth table where the premise set is true and the conclusion false. This means that the argument form is valid. If you do, then the argument form is invalid. Just to reiterate, a deductive argument is always composed of a premise or a premise set and a conclusion. What makes an argument valid or invalid is how truthful these two elements are. Let's take a look at these examples. All humans are mortal. Plato is human, therefore Plato is mortal. All the elements of this argument are true, premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion, thus making the argument valid. Now what about all birds can speak, therefore parrots can speak? The premise of this argument is false, as not all birds can speak. But the conclusion is true, as parrots are able to learn how to mimic human speech. So even if the premise of an argument is false, the conclusion remains true, the structure of the argument is still valid. Moving on, all birds can fly, therefore penguins can fly. While the argument isn't sound, as both the premise and conclusion are false, the structure of the argument is still valid. As regardless of whether the premise is true or not, What matters is that the conclusion remains true or it naturally follows the premise. As whenever it doesn't, the structure of an argument is invalid. Observe this example. If Roy lives in Quezon City, and Quezon is a city in the Philippines, then Roy lives in America. We can see that premises 1 and 2 are both true. However, it deviates by saying that instead of Roy lives in the Philippines, we're left with a false conclusion that states Roy lives in America. The point I'm trying to make is that any argument that doesn't have a premise that's true and a conclusion that's false follows a valid structure. Because if it did, like the previous example, it would be referred to as a tautology. That being said, Max Hokut arrogantly claims in his book, The Elements of Logical Analysis and Inference, that logic is deductive, reasoning is valid or invalid. This applies, as my own treatment illustrates, even to probability inference, which is strictly deductive in form. Induction is better thought of as guesswork, the formulation of hypotheses to be tested in accordance with strict canons of reasoning. Now, what exactly does this mean? You see, formal logicians aren't interested in the empirical or evaluative content of the premises and conclusion of your arguments. They're only interested in whether these elements make an argument structure valid or invalid, no in between. Logic is normative, meaning it doesn't describe how people create arguments. Instead, it's all about knowing how to construct an argument with a valid structure and avoid composing invalid ones. To further understand the concepts discussed throughout this module, let me give you a few more examples, and I'll need you to figure out as to whether the structure of those arguments are valid or invalid. For our first question, if cows are animals, and cows are carnivores, then all animals are carnivores. Next, if bachelors are unmarried men, and David is unmarried, then David is a bachelor. And lastly, if students who pass the UPCAT are allowed to enroll in UP, and Edward passed the UPCAT, then Edward isn't allowed to enroll in UP. Let me give you a few to examine these arguments. Were you able to analyze them? If so, let's verify your answers. By analyzing the first question, we can see that the first premise is true, as cows are considered animals. But the second premise and conclusion aren't, as cows are herbivores, not all animals are carnivores. So even if our conclusion is false, as long as we have at least one premise that's also false, the argument becomes valid. For our second question, this one's pretty easy. Bachelors are unmarried men, while bachelorettes are unmarried women, so the first premise is true. For the sake of this argument, let's say that David being unmarried is also true. Therefore, the conclusion of David being a bachelor is true. So, this is another valid argument. And finally, like all of us here, we needed to pass the UPCAT to be able to enroll in UP. So, the first premise is true. Let's say that some person named Edward did pass the UPCAT, making the second premise also true. However, we're left with a false conclusion that despite him passing the UPCAT, he isn't allowed to enroll in UP. Remember, if the premises of an argument are true and the conclusion is false, then the structure of that argument is automatically invalid.
Let's move to Unit 4, Analysis of Natural Arguments, with Module 1, the subject matter of informal logic. This module tackles informal logic, which in contrast to formal logic, relies on its content for its strength rather than its logical form. Informal logicians study arguments in their natural setting which occur in ordinary discourse. This module also tackles the following objectives. Let us first start with Trudy Gauvier's argument. The Canadian philosopher Trudy Gauvier mentions that formal logic cannot be used on real arguments in language. Formal logic is not suited for the ambiguous nature and complexity of real-world arguments, as it can only apply some argument in natural language after questions regarding interpretation, content, and substantive truth have already been resolved. Going back and using Wittgenstein's language games, we need to have an assortment of different types of arguments occurring naturally in various language games imaginable. Before fully exploring informal logic, let us first conduct an analysis of the content of the argument. Irving Copey defines an argument as the following. For an argument to be present, one of the asserted propositions must be claimed to follow from other propositions asserted to be true, which are presented as grounds for or reasons for believing the conclusion. In simpler words, in order to have an argument in logic or reasoning, you must have a conclusion and premises that supports or leads to your conclusion. With this in mind, let us start with a good example to highlight the subject matter within formal logic using different forms of argument. The first example currently displayed is an invalid argument form called affirming the consequent. It states that if it rains, ang gat dam will be full. Ang gat dam is full, therefore it rained. By the standards of formal logic, the argument above and any other argument with this logical structure is invalid, whatever its content may be. But within formal logic, you can see that the content of the argument displays the claim of the conclusion being supported strongly by the two premises. In the context of Copy's definition of an argument, this invalid form creates a paradox of certainty that because the dam is full, you are certain that it rained even though you did not observe it. This is because the two premises were used as grounds for believing the conclusion with Copy's definition of an argument. Let us now take a look at the second example, displaying the content as the valid argument form called modus ponens. If it rains, ang gat dam will be full. It rained, therefore ang gat dam is full. In this case, by the standards of formal logic, the argument form is valid. But within formal logic, when we take a look at its content, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the two premises for the simple reason that the rains may not be strong enough to fill the dam. This argument also does not fit the definition of Copy, which basically states that in the valid form, you cannot offer the two premises 1 and 2 as grounds for believing the conclusion, as the conclusion will not follow from the premises. There are multiple examples of invalid arguments that do not have a logical structure, but when you examine their content, the premises strongly support the conclusions. This can be seen in these instantations of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Feel free to pause the video to view them. Now that we are aware of the effects of looking into the content of arguments, let us formally define informal logic. According to Johnson, by informal logic, I mean to designate a branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards, criteria, procedures for the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, criticism, and construction of argumentation in everyday discourse. Using Johnson's perspective with the previous examples of the fallacy of affirming the consequent, it is easy to judge that the premises are true and the truth of the conclusion is confirmed by the truth of the premises in a non-deductive way. These arguments are classified as analytic arguments because the conclusions are supported by mere analysis of the meanings of the subject and predicate of the premises and conclusion. In contrast, the first two examples before regarding the Angat Dam is empirical because you use your senses to confirm these arguments. In informal logic, the non-deductive process where the premises confirm the truth of conclusion is the subject matter of informal logic, regardless of its logical form being invalid. Informal logic's main concern is with argument with various types of content in different language games. Informal logicians say that informal logic may be seen as a response to formal logic, specifically as an attempt to redress imbalance that occurred when formal deductive logic was put forward as a theory of argument. In simpler terms, informal logic is used in situations where limitations of formal logic isn't enough to evaluate arguments. This is commonly used in real-life arguments and everyday situations. The domain of informal logic stretches so far and wide that it is difficult to chart the terrain. With all of that being said, there are still some basic issues in informal logic. The first of which is the definition of an argument in informal logic. Many dislike the traditional model of premise set plus logical inference plus conclusion, since this is the mold of formal logic which they are trying to get away from. Others even believe that deductive arguments are not genuine arguments at all, because they are only forms of inference. There's also the debate on how many types of arguments there are. It's typology. In here, informal logicians are still thinking of criteria on how a premise should be related to the conclusion. The issue of when we can say that a premise is relevant or not to a conclusion is unsettled. They are also in search for the criteria for evaluation and criticism of arguments. The theory of appraisal is still being conceptualized and debated. With all of these issues in mind, the subject matter of informal logic is in turmoil. Now, how does Acuña think of this? Well, he mentions that if we define an argument by looking for its essence in ordinary discourse, we will not find it. He believes that we have to follow Wittgenstein's advice to look and see and don't think, as otherwise we would be committing the same mistake of formal logicians who claim that either your argument is deductive or else it is defective, and start rejecting all non-deductive arguments as counterfeit arguments. He said that we must be content with the definition being held together by family resemblance of traits and characteristics, since this would serve as the purpose of classifying arguments in ordinary discourse. In addition, he believes that the study of arguments as they occur in natural languages should as much as possible be language specific. The concept of argument, the standards of good and bad argument, and the criteria for evaluation and criticism may vary from one language game to another. We should not approach the study of an argument with any preconceived ideas in mind, because if we cannot find our preconceived idea in ordinary discourse, the philosopher's inclination is to invent it. We have to look for similarities as well as differences. These are important reminders of Wittgenstein in order to avoid essentialism.
Next, we will discuss about the theory of argument. An argument is a discourse where premises support a claim or conclusion. Arguments occur in both oral and written forms. The key goal is to understand how premises support the claim in daily situations. An example is, UP students should take more electives because it broadens their knowledge. The key point is a strong argument has clear premises and a valid conclusion, just like structured reasoning for an essay or a debate. In our everyday lives, we make arguments all the time, whether it's persuading our friends about where to eat, or discussing which study method is the best for us. Arguments help us convey our reasoning, and as students, we do this a lot, especially when writing essays or debating. In these contexts, understanding how to build and elevate arguments becomes essential. Next is we will have an overview of about the theory of argument. Its process must impart analytic skills for creating arguments, include metacognitive skills for criticism and counter-arguments, and strengthen weaker arguments. Think of argumentation like programming. Just as a programmer follows a specific process to create codes, argumentation has steps that help ensure the argument is logical and persuasive. Whether we're writing a thesis or discussing an issue with friends or classmates, we unconsciously follow these steps. In UP, this is particularly useful in classes where we have to break down concepts and present our views, as it encourages us to think critically. Next is the theory of argument has two theories. First is the theory of analysis. The key questions of the theory of analysis are how is an argument defined, what is the purpose of an argument, and how many types of arguments are there. An example is UP students arguing for or against environmental policies during a class discussion use empirical evidence, analytic reasoning, and evaluative principles to support their claims. Theory of analysis is about how we define, understand, and categorize arguments. It's useful when we're tasked with analyzing someone else's argument, such as during a class discussion. For example, if a classmate argues that hybrid learning should be standard, we can analyze if the reasoning is based on facts, logic, or values. This breakdown helps us understand their position more clearly and either agree or challenge it. Next is the theory of appraisal. It has evaluation and criticism. It is on how to assess if premises support conclusions and strength of connection between premise and claim. The key questions under theory of appraisal are how should an argument be evaluated and criticized, how to determine whether a premise is relevant or not, and what are the appropriate standards to measure argument strength. In theory of appraisal, it has two key aspects. Is premise relevance and standards for measuring argument strength. An example is when arguing for more student welfare programs, a premise like students face high mental stress. is relevant if it strongly supports the conclusion of implementing these programs. Evaluating an argument isn't just about agreeing or disagreeing. We need to understand if the premises truly support the conclusion. For instance, if someone claims that extending deadlines improves academic performance, we should ask if there's enough evidence for that, like studies or personal experience. Appraisal helps us judge how strong or weak their argument really is. Next, we will tackle about the types of arguments. First is the empirical. It is based on observable and factual evidence. One example is survey data showing most UP students prefer hybrid learning supports the claim that hybrid learning should be offered. Next is the analytic, based on logical definitions or formal sciences. An example is if every UP student requires 120 units to graduate and a student has completed 120 units, they are eligible for graduation. And lastly is the evaluative, based on moral, legal, or policy claims. One example is UP should reduce tuition fees because education is a fundamental right. As students, we use different types of arguments daily. When we discuss empirical arguments, like showing that majority of students prefer hybrid learning, we rely on observable facts or surveys. On the other hand, analytic arguments are more leaned on formulas or scientific formulas or logical formulas. We like logical statements that must be true if the premises are. Evaluative arguments, lastly, which we often see in moral or ethical discussions, rely on our values and beliefs. Understanding these types helps us choose or lets us think on the right approach when making or evaluating claims. Next is evaluating argument strength. A premise is relevant if it can verify or justify the conclusion. Example, claiming participating in extracurriculars improves social skills. It has relevance based on how well the premise supports the conclusion. There are criteria for strength. It's empirical, analytic, and evaluative, which are discussed earlier. Here, we focus on how strong the argument support is. For example, if someone says that joining organizations improves leadership skills, we need to assess whether the premises like involvement in or organization activities truly lead to that conclusion. Strong premises give strong support to the argument, and weak premises do the opposite. As students, we must assess these details when writing papers or engaging in debates. Next is the metacognitive skills in argumentation. It has self-criticism, being able to criticize your own arguments, and improving weaker arguments. It focuses on identifying weaker points in your reasoning and finding stronger premises to support your conclusions. Being self-critical is a key skill when forming arguments. It's important not just to defend your argument, but also to anticipate how someone else might challenge it. In an argumentative essay or debate, this is crucial. For example, when writing a paper, any paper that you can think of, if you predict what counter-arguments might arise and address them, your overall argument becomes stronger. And lastly, we will talk about the summary of the theory of argument. Argumentation is essential for decision-making, persuasion, and inquiry. The key takeaway for this is a strong argument must have relevant, clear premises and a solid conclusion. Using Ralph Johnson's theory of analysis and appraisal improves critical thinking, essential for both academic and everyday discourse. Mastering the theory of argument equips us with critical thinking skills, helping us engage in meaningful discussions and making sound and meaningful decisions. Whether it's in academic settings or in our everyday life, understanding how to create and evaluate arguments makes us more persuasive and helps us reason and argue better. The list of members of our group: Brent Lawrence M. Angeles, Jose Bien F. Polintan, and yours truly, John Benedict V. Humamoy. And that is all. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion.